Hello, I'm Chris White. Today I'm going to be talking to you about 25 years of homebrewing from here in San Diego, California. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, a little bit of story behind the 25 years of homebrewing and White Labs, and technical information that should apply to different people in the audience. Please put in some questions, because the second half, for about 30 minutes, we're going to do question and answer. So if you type in your questions to the Q&A area as the seminar goes along, Eric, who's helping me, will coordinate those for the second half. And if you have any questions, you can also email him, Eric Fowler, whose email is in the instructions for this webcast. Also, I'm going to launch this poll. Oops, sorry. So please go ahead and put in what applies to you. If you're a home brewer, that'd be under enthusiast. If you're from different parts of a brewery or non-brewery beverage producer, go ahead and add that as well. We're happy to have you all join. This is the second week of our webcasts we started to do on Wednesdays through this COVID-19 pandemic, where a lot of people are at home. So we wanted to do something we could reach out and share some information. Joe Karowski gave last Wednesday's talk about R&D that applied to a lot of brewery applications, but also had homebrewing information. And that's been posted to YouTube, so you can look for that or email us if you can't find it. This one, today's webcast, will also be posted. So White Labs started from homebrewing. I was a homebrewer, as many people are that are listening today. Whether you're a commercial brewer or a lab person or a beer enthusiast or homebrewer, a lot of us have started in homebrewing, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But I was fortunate to be at UC Davis as an undergrad and fell into brewing technical information and homebrewing, and then came to graduate school at UCSD, and early on started homebrewing. Continued my homebrewing and took a class in all grain homebrewing because I wanted to make better beer. And that was with Yusef Chernay, who ended up with Jack White, starting Ballast Point Brewery in San Diego. But at that time, they had a store called Homebrew Mart. And there's a picture of young me brewing with Yusef on our half barrel system that he made. And we just brewed every week and just for homebrew. It eventually turned into yeast for White Labs and beer for Ballast Point. But the fun thing about it was we weren't doing it for that reason at the time. We were just trying to make great beer, which led to all the yeast cultures that I was able to get and learn how to make and the beers. So before those breweries, Yusef and I made a little yeast culture kit, and we started selling it at Homebrew Mart. Turns out nobody really bought it. And so I realized, even though the information was awesome, a lot of people wanted to know more about yeast culturing, but really they wanted yeast. And so then I started making yeast for Homebrew Mart. And I did that for a couple of years before selling it to anybody else. And Homebrew Mart's still in San Diego. I had a lot of early heroes in homebrewing, which just led me to want to make more beer because of the writing from these folks. Charlie Papazian on the left, came out with a book on the joy of homebrewing in 1984. And earlier than that, started the Brewers Association and the American Homebrewers Association, and then later the Great American Beer Festival. But the joy of homebrewing was I just found it at a bookstore in Davis, and who could not want to just start homebrewing after reading that book? It was funny, it was interesting, it made the hobby sound fun. And so that's what I started doing. And then Michael Jackson was a beer writer that wrote so romantically about beer. I used to carry around his pocket guide to beer, and go to all the different breweries, and you had a lot in Europe as well when I started going over there and drinking beer and collecting yeast. And all of his books, if you haven't read them, get some of them. They really, he just had an amazing style of writing, and made you want to drink those beers that he wrote about. And George Fix was also a really early homebrew pioneer. He really focused on the homebrewing side, and he was a math professor at first in Texas. And he's got a couple books that are still available. You can get. He's passed away, but his books have lived on, and the Principles of Brewing Science. And one of my favorite books of all time is Analysis of Brewing Techniques. That I think is a fascinating read. A lot of deep research went into a pretty small book, and the research was pretty difficult probably at that time. But those writers, and getting to know them a little bit too over the coming years after I started White Labs, was awesome, because they were true mentors and inspiration for me to want to keep brewing and to want to stay in this industry. So I put a little business plan together. That's the copy of it in the middle of the screen in 1995, and kind of updating it, and started working through different sort of logos. That graphic on the front page of the business plan is the only graphic I had in the business plan. And oops, I forgot about financials, because you just write about ideas. And now that's what so many of us has done in this industry. We have ideas, we have things we want to make. And so that when I read people's business plans today, I usually go, oops, you forgot the heavy duty financial plan you need to do here, because that's really what's going to take to make successful business. Learning that. And I had to force myself to learn that part too. But then, that was the second building. Sort of the second building, little pictures of really small little warehouse. That's Tommy Arthur's car in front of White Labs, who's now, Port Brewing, and got Lost Abbey Brewing. He's got really famous in the brewing industry. He's a great brewer. And we just worked every day to try to figure out how to make the best yeast possible, and starting adding services like analytical services, really chemistry lab, education, visiting homebrew stores, visiting breweries, and going through different rounds of things like different packages and different strains. So as I said, the original customer was Homebrew Mart here in San Diego. But soon after that, I started working with Pizza Port, but at the time they were called Solana Beach Brewery. They had one location in Solana Beach, and that's what a lot of breweries did at that time. If I know there's a mixture of all sorts of ages and experiences here, and so some of the people that were going to breweries back then might remember that you kind of had your restaurant name and then you had your brewery name, but it would sort of be weird. People thought to call your brewery like Pizza Port Brewery. Well, that'd be weird. It's not weird anymore, right? So people don't really do that anymore. That's just helped with the spread of craft beer. And you just use your name and it's okay. But Pizza Port was the first brewery where I supplied some yeast. They added it to a beer, and the beer tasted great, and off I was, and off they were to making more cultures. And Blind Pig Brewery was the second brewery, and that's a neat little story, because that's Vinny Trelurzo, who started Russian River with his wife, and obviously a very famous brewer, great beers, but he started in the San Diego region in Temecula at Blind Pig Brewery. And so we supplied a limited number of strains, originally WP001 California Ale yeast. That was the first strain. And why? Because I liked home brewing with it. It's still my favorite strain. It is still White Lab's top selling strain. It's clean, but interesting, versatile, flocculates well, has the performance side and the flavor side, huge range of beers. And it turns out it was awesome for IPAs. And that's not something we knew in mid-90s, because IPAs weren't on the map yet. People started adding more hops, but it was amber ales at the time. And if you look at any breweries in the mid-90s, early 90s, so their first beers were all ambers, even if they don't make them anymore. And so IPAs came later, but California Ale yeast was awesome for IPAs because that hops character, the bitterness, the hop flavor characters that brewers ended up paying a lot for as hops got more expensive, came through so nicely in California ale yeast. And then English ale yeast, because I liked English style beers, and it's a completely different strain, very, very flocculent. People almost call it, coagulated or something, because the way it looks in a package, it's very, very clumpy. That's because the cells are all sticking to each other so aggressively. And that flocculation has some nice advantages in brewing, especially home brewing, so you don't have to filter, and it's ready to consume a lot faster. And then Hefeweizen yeast, that was sort of the craft brewery's first specialty beer. You might make your amber ale, because breweries starting at that time kind of made one beer, and then they started making Hefeweizen beers. And so I started producing some Hefeweizen yeast for them. And then also a lager yeast, WP 810 San Francisco lager yeast. And you can see in the picture of those early vials there off my desktop printer labels that we added Trappist ale yeast soon after that, because I love Belgian style beers. And we've changed that name since then to Monastery ale yeast because of the Trappist trademark and respect for those beers. And then we put our pro yeast in larger sizes. Those are 1 liter sizes on the top that is in film. And we went away from that for years, but it's interesting. We started out that way. We went to big bottles, and then we went back to film, but making it in a different way. And that's kind of what the package looks like here. So currently we have 3 production facilities. The original one in San Diego, one in Asheville, North Carolina. That's pretty similar size to San Diego, a lot newer, but fairly similar size, with a restaurant as well, because we have the brewery in San Diego as well, and Asheville, and then a restaurant there. So we're just trying to make them open to the public. We have tours. It's very unusual to be able to take a tour of a yeast factory. And so that's what we offer, and that's what we try to bring in with the public. And so it's still mostly beer, but we're working with wineries and spirit producers, cider, kombucha, mead, and other beverages, from the professional to the enthusiast. It's also expanded beyond 4 or 5 strains to over 70. So we have 70 core strains we make every week to a certain level. And then we also make vault strains. Those are the strains we make a little less often, but they rotate through. And we have listings of those on our websites, and private strains for different breweries or distilleries or entities that want something that they own. We do a little contract manufacturing for yeast with Yeast Bay and a little bit more. And then we added, as I said, the chemistry lab, which we call the analytical lab, for just all sorts of beverage analysis, beer analysis, IBUs, alcohol, nutrients, gluten. And then we do nutrients and enzymes, and those I'll talk a little bit about just in terms of brewing, because there are nutrient and enzyme needs depending on the beer style that has definitely become more apparent over the last 25 years. And education, because we like teaching, and yeast is something that's still there's a lot of mystery surrounding yeast, and there still is. We don't know everything about yeast. But a lot of people in this hobby and industry have not come from microbiology, right? So it's natural not to just to be sort of come naturally to everybody. Science is kind of made fun of a lot from, thinking about science in school. Maybe that's, how it's taught, or so anyway, there's tons of different backgrounds that come into brewing, and that's great. Because that all adds together with the art and sensory and everything else that we need. And so we've enjoyed doing education. This is one of the examples where we're doing more of that. And then, as I say, we have a brewery to showcase what yeast does, and then a restaurant in North Carolina. So the package you see there currently for commercial brewing, that's a 2 liter size. That's the most common size we sell to breweries in increments of 2 liters. And I did a podcast this week for Brad Smith of Beersmith, and that came out this week. You might want to go there if you want to find out more how we make yeast. There's, of course, applications to anybody that's making, that wants to do some propagation and things at home. And so that's on his website. We go into that was, it gets pretty technical, and that's the topic that he wanted for that show, and it explains a lot of yeast making. But one thing on the top of that graphic is a QC label. We do live QC on every lot that's produced. In pure pitch, the difference in that film is the yeast is grown in the film, and rather than filled in the film. So there's no filling. And we do a complete QC on every lot and print that on the professional packages. But on the homebrew packages, you can get that lot information too, that QC information. You can go to yeastman.com and type in the lot number, because the package is smaller, there's not room for all the information, but you can type in that lot number and get the complete QC sheet, take a screenshot of it, print it out, whatever you like to do. So now I'll talk a little bit about what's changed over the years. Yeast starters terminology has been part of homebrewing and homebrewing debates since the beginning days of homebrewing. And it's still perhaps one of the most talked about on the internet aspects of homebrewing that commercial brewers almost never talk about. So from that perspective, it's sort of interesting. But what people do talk about, of course, is cell counts. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about yeast shelf lives and yeast health, the use of oxygen and nutrients, which again, early days was sort of, I don't know, just do it this way. And as we shared more and more information, homebrewers were some of the earliest people on the internet sharing information. And we've learned a lot about that, how to make better beers, because the whole point of working with some of these parameters is to make the best beer possible. And different ingredients and trends, and then the evolution of homebrewers to pro. I'm sure a lot of people listening today that are professional brewers started out as homebrewers. So the way starters started was the cell counts for the liquid yeast that was available in the early 90s was very low. There was a few companies selling liquid yeast before White Labs. Most didn't make it a few years, but they would have about 5 billion cells in a homebrew package. So if you added that directly to your 20 liters, your 5-gallon homebrew, which is 20 liters, you would have about 250,000 cells per mil. Very low pitch rate, right? That would take about 3 days for fermentation to start. That's too long. And I was a home brewer in those days. I was using those packages. I know that was a fact. And that was the cell counts that were in those packages. So they were great in that liquid yeast was available for people wanting to make beer, but you had to make a starter. And most people were making about a pint starter, 500-600 mils at that point. And then you could have faster fermentation. So the drive to cell count, as I said, was really worked because of the communication between home brewers and people. Of course, a few started commercial breweries. One of those people was Greg Noonan, and he wrote a book in 1986, Brewing Lager Beer, and then a new edition of that, New Brewing Lager Beer. And to me, that was the first time really that the idea of 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato in terms of a cell count was printed for the craft brewer. Charlie's books were great, but he certainly didn't talk about pitch rates in this way. And what I find kind of interesting is that's the number that was pulled and used for it as the starting point for homebrew and craft beer as the goal. Even though Greg Noonan was correct, and he pointed out that the British used about half of that in British ales, about 0.5, 0.6 million cells per mil. But that was sort of overlooked, and we just went to the 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato, which was originally more of a lager rate. And so we've adopted that into kind of craft brewing and home brewing. And nothing wrong with that. That's good. It starts the fermentation really nice. It leaves behind a little of flavor because, and even Greg pointed out back then, that's why the British pitched a little less, because they wanted more yeast flavor, driven beers. and that's what those beers were sort of known for, the ester profiles and things like that. So we've sort of used this number now, 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato, and about double that for lagers today. So brewers get very fast fermentations. And so as that progressed in terms of White Lab's history and your homebrewing history, what you see is after we started in 1995, we started with 50 billion cells in a package. And that's why we called it pitchable yeast at the time. It was revolutionary for the time because there was no liquid yeast that you could add and fermentation start the next morning, 12, 15 hours later, 8 hours later. And it got you into the millions of cells per mil range. So regardless of the 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato number, that's going to be familiar to some people, not be familiar to new people, but what you need to be is in the millions of cells per mil range when you're making beer. When you add that yeast to your 5-gallon batch or your 100-barrel batch, whatever it is, you want your yeast in the millions of cells per mil range. So you've got to start with yeast that is in the high billions of cells per mil range because you're adding a little bit into your fermenters. So as I said, 5 billion wasn't enough to do that in 5 gallons. You would only get 250,000 cells per mil. So with 50 billion, you'd get about 2.5 million cells per mil. And that would get your fermentation started within that time period. But of course, people wanted more yeast, and that's what competition does as well. Among yeast producers, among people asking for things. So now home brewers are able to get yeast in the 100 to 200 billion cells total range, and really bypassing the starter step. But since starters are so embedded in home brewing, since they have advantages, there's nothing wrong with them at any scale. And if you like working with yeast, they're fun. They're still done, but maybe not in that middle range where people were getting, up to 4-liter starters. 4-liter starters for 20-liter batch is a lot. But I'm sure there's a lot of people listening and still doing that, even with the higher cell counts. And same thing with commercial brewing. When I started, there weren't that sizes of liquid yeast. You had to start in about one barrel. That was about the most yeast you could get as a commercial brewery. And it may cost you a couple $100, $250 or so. And so we did the same thing with commercial breweries, starting out there with Peat Sport, making yeast that would be pitchable in a 7-barrel batch. And then, of course, breweries are much bigger now. So this is what a yeast starter looks like for a lot of people. Yeast and wort in a flask on a stir plate. Stir plate keeps it moving around, gets better cell growth. So the yeast is also, higher quality and quantity today. So as I said, not everybody is doing the starters. And professional breweries, as I said, don't even use that word, really. They might do a propagation. They might work with yeast in smaller sizes, but a lot are directly inoculating, pitching the wort with the right amount of yeast. But it's still one of the most debated topics. I mean, while it had to be in the 90s, it's such an interesting topic. And I'm sure there's some psychology wrapped around it as well, because it's something you can count. You can get a microscope and you can count the yeast. And that's awesome. So you can see what's in it. We print the actual cell counts of those lots directly on those QC sheets. So you can always see that as well. Try to be transparent throughout the process, offering the tours of the facilities, putting all that information on the QA sheets, so you can calculate that. But some of the things you can't count, as I'll talk about later, or don't count very often, are the aspects that can really be the hidden secrets to making great beer. So the key really here is for the cell counts, you want to be in the millions of cells per mil range in the beer. And if you want 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato, for a 12 Plato beer, that'd be 12 million cells per mil. 12 Plato is about 1040 specific gravity. And the more active the yeast is, the better the fermentation is going to be. Same thing if you're making bread, right? People proof the yeast. They want to make sure it's working before they add it to the beer. The starter is almost proofing it. the yeast if you felt that was necessary, if you're working with especially older yeast or doing a high gravity beers. And so that'll probably stick around. Even as yeast get more and more available in larger sizes. So the shelf life of yeast have also expanded. When I was in school in the early days, people said, oh, liquid yeast only survives 2 days. And then it was a week or maybe 2 weeks. White Labs has up to a 6 month shelf life for a lot of strains. And others have some long shelf lives as well. And that's just through growing the yeast right. Putting, for us, the pure pitch helps because the yeast breathes the CO2 out of the film, and we don't introduce oxygen when we're packaging. Those things really help extend the shelf life, but everybody's sort of working on little things that to help extend the shelf lives of yeast to make it more available around the world. The biggest things that have changed probably is the understanding of oxygen and nutrients. And this has implications throughout beverage fermentation. Everybody has a hard time sort of working with yeast because it's a biological process, right? So in brewing, we do our hot side, we do our boil, we run it off, and we add our yeast, and we just go, okay, now let biology do its thing. And that's pretty fascinating as a topic. But what brewers have learned is some of those controls, by pitching the right amount of yeast, by adding the right amount of oxygen and nutrients, they can really help ensure the most probable success and the best tasting beer. So what happened with oxygen in the beginning is, people don't really think about it. Lots of old textbooks say, well, when you run the beer off, just let it drop into your carboy, it'll pick up oxygen. Well, also, that's not a very good aseptic technique. And you're going to pick up some bacteria. The most common way was shake it. That's what I did. I shook that carboy. And now that I can measure how much dissolved oxygen is in there, really what you're getting is about 1 to 3 ppm dissolved oxygen. Because you're trying to get that oxygen from the gas state in the air to the liquid state in your wort. And the colder it is, the more oxygen you'll pick up. But again, in early homebrewing too, how good were we able to get nail the temperature after runoff? But so we were talking about 1 to 3 ppm of dissolved oxygen, and fermentation still worked because yeast are microorganisms that are survivors. They will do it, but it's not optimum for the flavor and the performance and viability of the yeast for successive generations. So people experiment with higher levels of oxygen, adding oxygen, air through a fish pump, kind of, that would add oxygen to a fish tank, or air into a fish tank, and oxygen is part of air. And that's better, but what's most common now is to use pure oxygen and pump it into the beer through a stone and getting really, really small bubbles, which helps dissolve that gas into the liquid, and getting about 8 to 10 ppm of dissolved oxygen. And that's a real key to making great beer. You hear different things, but regardless of what yeast you're using and how you're doing it, if you can get 8 to 10 ppm dissolved oxygen in the wort, that's where you want to be. It's most helpful for repitching, because that 8 to 10 ppm is going to make each new yeast cell help to make it right. Because a yeast cell is surrounded by membranes. The only way yeast can make certain parts of those membranes is with dissolved oxygen. So the dissolved oxygen is not making them respire and it's not doing that kind of thing. It's helping making the membranes around the yeast cells. So if one yeast that you add has to grow to 5 to 6 new cells, if you don't give it the right amount of oxygen, 8 to 10 ppm, it might only make 3.5 new cells, because it doesn't have enough membrane material without that oxygen. And the membranes it's going to make are going to be weaker, because those pieces that oxygen are used, the unsaturated fatty acids and sterols, are really key for a correct membrane. So if yeast don't grow to the right number, also that viability of that resulting yeast won't be as good. The repitchings will be more poor. But even that same beer is not going to have the same final gravity without the right amount of oxygen. You're leaving some of that gravity behind. You might finish at 3 Plato instead of 2.5, for example, if you're at 5 ppm versus 10. So it's just as important as pitch rate. But as I said, you'll find it talked about a lot less in the literature, because who wants to talk about oxygen? And who really measures oxygen? Now, a lot of commercial breweries are now buying the instrumentation that costs a few $1,000s to measure dissolved oxygen in wort. And that I would encourage for all breweries to do. And home brewers, you can have a pretty easy time achieving, at least in 5 gallons, 8 to 10 ppm with 2 minutes of pure oxygen through a stone at, around 20 C, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's oxygen. That's a real key takeaway. Oxygen is important to making the best beer. And anybody out here making homebrew batches or small batches, that is probably your goal. It was my goal in homebrewing. I wanted my beer to taste great. I just gave away for the first few years when I didn't think it tasted very good. So the other thing that has changed is the use of nutrients. When I started too, people would say, well, you don't have to add nutrients. Wort has everything. And that is kind of true. Since we make beers out of grain, malted barley usually, it has an awesome mixture of nutrients. You don't see that when you're making wine or cider or other things. And so those industries are used to adding other things when they can. And that's important for you to know as brewers, because we're making all sorts of things now. Lots of states in the United States allow brewers to make other things like hard cider, hard seltzer, kombuchas, even wines now in some states. And so a good understanding of nutrients are going to help you in all of those industries and homebrewing, things you're making. So what's also helped with that is product availability of yeast nutrients has increased. Several suppliers have yeast nutrients. We sell yeast nutrients. We just came out with a new one 2 weeks ago that's designed more for hard seltzer, because people are having a hard time with that, because water doesn't have any nutrients, right? So a lot of people that are used to home brewing or commercial brewing, they do the same thing they're used to, add the yeast. Oops, not much happens, because that doesn't have the nutrients yeast needs in water. So you have to add a lot of nutrients. And that's why that understanding helps you. Non-barley based fermentations, like I said, hard seltzers and a lot of those. High and low gravity brewing. If you want to make a 12% beer that doesn't taste like candy, very, very, estery, you're going to have to be good at nutrients and oxygen. And sometimes you're looking to increase the fermentation speed, consistency, or if you're doing yeast propagation, which starters could be viewed as maybe a bit of a yeast propagation, but it's a weird one because it's a massive amount of yeast at a small volume. And zinc is one of the minerals is we kind of call nutrients, it could be amino acids, it could be mineral salts, things like that. But zinc is a metal that is extremely important in beer fermentations. And we know that much more than we did 25 years ago. I kind of knew zinc was important because I talked to a lot of the old timers, and some of the old consultants would tell me that are since retired, their secret in helping out beer fermentations was dabbling in some zinc into some breweries fermenters. And so we have focused on that for a long time. And the textbooks will tell you, 0.1, 0.2 ppm zinc. That's fine, but how many people are measuring zinc levels at home? We do that in our analytical lab, but still not that many people send samples to have an analysis of their zinc levels. And so what is surprising is to a lot of breweries is they send them their samples for analysis. They're adding some zinc salts into their boil because they've read that 0.1 to 0.2 is good. And they find it's 0. Well, it's 0 because zinc loves to stick to protein, called chelation. And what is in grain fermentations, grain wort, malted barley is a high level of protein. And we pull that out through the whirlpool. right? We do a hot side, hot chill, cold chill, all those things, cold break. And all those breaks are protein. And that zinc goes with that protein. And so that's why it's so critical that you add zinc back if you want the most consistent fermentation, you want the best yeast health later, and to drive that fermentation to completion, because zinc is needed in so many of the enzyme steps, including the generation of ethanol. The last step in ethanol production, that enzyme requires zinc to be right there at the enzyme when it does its reaction. So the concentration of zinc has to be really important inside the yeast cell. So outside the yeast cell, when you start, it has to be important to get inside the yeast cell. And so we started selling Cerevomyces over a decade ago as a way to supply bound zinc on dead yeast to brewer's yeast in a more efficient way, so it wouldn't get pulled out in the whirlpool. So zinc yeast like that. There's new ways of adding zinc salts that people have learned, even on the cold side, which you'll find on the internet, and more people are talking about it, because that you can avoid with the whirlpool, losing the whirlpool, but you have to clean that up a little bit through a good boil or autoclave. So the two things from that last slide could help any brewer, any fermentation person, is optimizing the oxygen and optimizing the zinc. And your range of brewing talents and styles you can make will expand a lot. So, nail your cell counts and then optimize oxygen and zinc, and you'll have a really good probability of success, as long as you sanitize great, which is also the job of the brewer. If you're not doing great sanitation, aseptic process through the cold side, a lot of these little tips and tricks won't really shine. So another thing that's kind of changed over the years is just ingredients and trends, right? I mean, every few weeks there's a new style created, often by homebrewers, that gets into commercial brewery. But now the use of ancient grains, coffee, chocolate, vanilla, unique flavor additions, hazy IPAs, those have become super popular. Brutes were momentary, and I think they had they could have been great, but didn't really stick around for different reasons. Kvike now is all the rage because you can ferment at higher temperatures and still make clean beers. So we're producing more Kvike strains as well. And that's what we kind of do, try to look at what's popular, look what people want, and start researching those strains and bringing those strains into our either core or vault portfolios. And then there just keeps coming more and more yeast strains as they're matching beer styles. And as I said earlier, one of the cool things is that in this industry is the home brewers becoming craft brewers. I believe there would be no craft brewing industry without home brewing. Home brewers became the fanatical beer fans, driving for tasting all these new beer styles. Originally, those were European beers. But then they said, okay, let's start breweries because we want them here. So then they started the craft breweries. And then the wider public noticed. Around the recession that kind of happened around the world in 2008, 2009, we saw, just started growing. The craft beer industry grew because people outside the home brewing and craft brewing networks, the just general person on the street started noticing craft beer. But that originated out of home brewing, in my opinion. And there's still that's still what's happening today when people are opening. A lot of the new breweries that are opening are tap rooms. And that's a really accessible thing for a home brewer to do. I'm making great beer. I'll start a little brewery and just sell my beer over the tap room. And it gives a way for some new brewers to also figure out some of the difficulties, because it's actually really hard to make commercial beer consistently to the highest perfection level possible, the lowest oxygen levels in the final beer. Oxygen, you need it at the right level at the beginning, and then you need almost nothing at the end because it hurts the shelf life of beer so tremendously. But all those little things you learn in home brewing help a lot when you go to commercial brewing. And that's the thing, like distillers and some other industries don't have the ability to do. And so that's a really great thing about home brewing. Going to wrap this up and start answering questions. I just want to mention that next week is National Beer Day on April 7th. So we are going to do a virtual collaboration brew because of the COVID-19 that's going on right now. Like I said, a lot of people are at home, so we're doing this virtual brew day, and we're going to do a little discussion and toast at 3 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday. If anybody wants to join in with the virtual collaboration, we also have the recipe if you want to brew that beer. And then next week, we will continue these free Wednesday webcast series at 10 a.m. Pacific time on lager fermentations for the craft brewer. Trolls Prawl will be joining us. He's been a longtime White Labs person who helped us start White Labs Copenhagen. So he's going to be doing this show from Copenhagen at 10 a.m. Pacific time. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions now. I'm going to need my glasses. Okay, the WP 860 Munich Helles yeast is the very best lager yeast I have ever used and extremely consistent. Why is it not produced and sold year round? Great question. I love that yeast as well. I love Munich Helles, and that strain gives a lot of that awesome character to that kind of lighter lager beer. Well, that kind of goes to the difference of the core strains and the vault strains. We want to make 500 strains a week, but there has to be some balance between making the yeast people need and making all the interesting strains we want to. And there's only so much reactor space here. I mean, we've driven to make the largest production volume for liquid yeast available by having the multiple facilities and increasing our reinvesting to make our facilities as efficient and as large as possible. But we still only have so many reactors that we can do a day. We start yeast 7 days a week. We work 7 days a week. We keep everything full. And so 70 strains is already a really high number. And so when we started the Vault program, it was a way to get better at releasing specialty strains. We talk about it every week, how to make that program better, how to make those strains more visible. We have Vault strains right now in packages that people probably don't know about. You can find those on yeastman.com and you can see what's there, but that's probably not the most best way for us to show how it's available. So we're going to get better at making specialty strains like that, and letting you know when they're available. Thank you. Okay, next question. I recently brewed with a Mexican lager yeast, WLP 940, also another of my favorite strains, Mexican lager yeast, and had trouble finding information about yeast starter temperatures. So is it better to propagate lager yeast at the fermentation temperature in the 50 to 55 Fahrenheit or room temperature? So here's another starter question, right? And this is kind of what I mean. There's a billion starter questions. And the answer to most of them are, it doesn't really matter. I know that's a little surprising because that volume is so small. You're making 500 mil, 1 liter, 2 liter starter, and with a whole bunch of yeast. Not much happens in that starter anyway. There's not much sugar available to each yeast cell. So, and you can do experiments. What's great, you can do it at one temperature, do it at another temperature. What you'll see is not much difference. But it's a solid question anyway, because it's about lager yeast temperatures. And should you do a starter at a lager yeast temperature? Should you, I think you can do all starters, at about, between 70, room temperature. Room temperature for a starter is fine. 70, 75, 20, 25 C, something like that. And because you want your starter, you want your yeast growing at a good temperature. It doesn't grow much in a starter anyway, but because there's not much sugar available, but it doesn't really need to be at fermentation temperature either, because in the classical methods like 2 million barrel breweries of 50 years ago, you know, they would do this long lager process starting at about room temperature in the lab, in the smaller scales. And then when they got to the batch before the batch, you know, they would bring it down to that lager temperature. But 10% of that was going into the final beer, right? Because that as the propagation works, it goes into the next beer. It's not like they collect the sediment like a lot of people do with starters and add that little sediment. They added the whole volume. So they needed to really get the flavor correct in the parts of the propagation. So if you're adding the full volume of the starter, I say yes, do the fermentation temperature. If you're not adding the full volume of the starter and you're adding just the yeast pack, you can be at room temperature. Next part of that question is, your website recommends 12 to 18 hours for yeast starters. What other sites recommend 24 to 48? I use a stir plate. Is it better to stop growth? You know, I'm not surprised. Our website might say that. I don't say that. I think I like every step. Ideally, every step for yeast should be 48 hours. But with a starter, you don't really need that. 24 is okay. Again, the difference between 18 and 24, it doesn't really matter too much, but because not much is happening in the starter. I mean, there's no big growth curve. There's very little CO2 production because you're not getting anaerobic and making alcohol, because there's not enough carbohydrate per yeast cell to do that. So with a starter, you're not really growing the yeast like you're typically growing yeast in a lab. It's where you want the 48 hours time periods. So 18, 40, 24 hours, 12 hours, even if you let it go 48, you're okay. How important is it to add yeast nutrient to my starters? And I can't emphasize it enough because kind of like what I was talking about earlier, you don't have to if it's all malt beer wort. But if you add nutrients, especially zinc, you're going to have a better fermentation. You're going to have the correct flavor profile, the correct attenuation, and better, healthier yeast afterwards. And so especially in a starter situation where you want the best yeast possible, it's the perfect place to add at least zinc. There's, like I said, the textbooks will tell you 0.1, 0.2 ppm zinc. There's new research showing that maybe even up to 1 ppm zinc, 10 times the 0.1, right? 1 ppm zinc can be good when you're doing propagations. And that's from Graham Walker, kind of the world's expert on nutrition for brewer's yeast. He's a professor in Scotland. And so zinc is super important. Another question is, how did you come to collect all of the yeast strains through the years? Well, I love craft beer. I love homebrewing. I love brewing. That's why we started a brewery too. And so I would go to places where I liked the beers. I would collect yeast. If I couldn't collect yeast there, I would find out what yeast bank in Europe had yeast that I could research. And while I was doing this homebrewing, I was in graduate school, working in a lab, and I was there days and nights and weekends. So I was having a little fun doing some yeast stuff on the side and beer stuff. So I would work with my yeast cultures there. And over time, I just accumulated more and more and more yeast. So most of the yeast strains we sell today were sourced through some of these yeast banks in Europe that started soon after Emil Christian Hansen isolated lager yeast in Copenhagen at Carlsberg in the 1880s. And Carlsberg started the first brewing yeast library. Really a yeast bank. And so we've got yeast strains from that collection or those collections that came off of that and other things, and sometimes different breweries. And we continue to get new strains every week. Sometimes there are strains that breweries send to us to keep just for them as private strains. Sometimes it's strains we've actively collected, sometimes a combination where somebody might send us a strain, but they don't want to keep it as a private strain. So it's something we work on every week through today. So, and that's why we keep releasing new strains in the vault. Whatever happened, next question, whatever happened to the War Pigs location in Copenhagen? That's a good point. So when we started White Labs in Copenhagen, we did that at the same time Mikkeller was starting their brew pub in Copenhagen called War Pigs. And they did that with 3 Floyds. And so there was space in the middle, and we're all friends and things. So we put White Labs in the middle of that. And that was a great way for us to all start out together. And the idea was that fermentation space in true kind of collaboratory ways would go towards their new fermenters, and we would move into a larger location. And it worked perfectly in that timing. They needed their warpace was successful. It's great food there. They chose to do Texas barbecue in the middle of Copenhagen, and they pulled it off great. And so then White Labs moved into a building behind, and now into a really nice building out by the airport. And then we have some collaboratory space in a different area next to Amas. Do you have special yeast for no or very low alcohol homebrew beers that still gives nice esters and phenols? Somebody asked Joe last week too about no alcohol beers. And I think that's really interesting. It's very popular in parts of the world. And sometimes that's through legislation. Some countries say if you're going to have beer on tap, you have to have a non-alcohol beer available. The United States doesn't really legislate like that, even on alcohol strengths. So I think, to me, it's not surprising that it's not as popular in the United States. But there is growing interest, and you can do it. Joe talked a little bit about it last week. He and I think that the best way to do it is to remove the alcohol after making a nice beer, because if you do it through yeast, you're going to end up with something sweet because you're going to use a yeast that doesn't ferment maltose. And to me, I really don't like to have sweet beers, but that's personal. A lot of people do want to go through the yeast channels. We are working with different strains. We're making different strains. We'll have some strains in the vault very shortly. We also got to pay attention to people, patenting certain things in this industry, and we got to look at that. And sometimes those have been yeast strains, so that's sort of slowed some of the things down we've done on the yeast side. But yeah, you'll see more and more from us on that in the future. Here's another question, I think, long question. Oh, sorry, it wasn't a question. It was just talking about some of our strains that you'll see more and more into the vault, but WLP 618, 618, yeah, the WLP 603, and some others that we're working on. So I think that'll stick around because, hey, somebody's driving, somebody doesn't want to drink alcohol anymore, whatever the case is, it might be January, and somebody's taking the month off to have a non-alcohol beer is great. Next question, what is the idea for Frankenstout? Were you surprised that it turned out to be delicious? So Frankenstout is a beer that we made in our brewery at White Labs in about 2014, I think. And it was part of a, we were working on, in collaboration with this DNA sequencing project it's turned out a paper on the full genome sequence of 157 yeast strains that came out in 2016, and then another paper on specializing on lager yeast that you can find. And when we first started this collaboration with the 157 yeast strains, first it started with 96 yeast strains from White Labs and a few other people. You know, homebrewers were part of it, local companies in San Diego were part of it, White Labs was part of it. And so we started with this 96 yeast strains. And for people in science, you'll know what that means, because a lot of these things pieces of equipment that you use a 96 well plate. So it's a plate with little 96 little impressions on it. You put your little samples in there, and then you sequence those, for example, 96 yeast strains together. And so Trolls and I said, why don't we make a beer out of these 96 yeast strains? And of course, it's sort of a no-brainer, right? Let's see what these beers taste like, since we had a brewery. And I was really excited. Actually, that was 2013, because I was on a trip. I came back. I was really excited to see how that beer would taste. And you know, 96 pure strains put together on purpose, making a beer out of making a 9% stout. And it was wonderful. I didn't know it would be good or bad. It had a combination of all of those flavor profiles. When you mix yeast together, they make all of their flavor profiles, right? So they make all these things in combination. So mixed cultures are awesome. And then they have the attenuation flocculation properties of something in the middle. But they make this combination of flavor and aroma compounds that's really exciting. So the beer had tasted like it had been aged in wood. It had never seen wood. And that's all that microflora adding contribution. So we still regularly make that beer. How do you know the expiration on any given yeast pack is another question. We print the best before date on all of the packages. You can also see that in a little bit more detail if you like on the QC sheets that are, as I said, you can search all the lots and find that out. But we've always, that lot travels with our production from the beginning. Our freezes, our Petri dishes, our flasks, our large vessels, that lot for traceability tracks all the way through. And so when we do our final QC, including cell count, when that cleared the QC, we print that on the package and on the QC sheet. And so that best before date is based on when we clear the QC, which is right after we grow it. So we don't put it into some other intermediate storage thing, package it later, and put a packaging date. You don't really know when that yeast was made. Ours, it's when it's cleared the QC process. Next question. We've got a lot of questions. If you over pitch, do you not risk not getting esters such as you would like to get more flavor? Okay, let me think about this question. So if you over pitch, okay, so what I'm interpreting that is if you over pitch, do you risk not getting the flavors you're looking for? Absolutely. So, okay, 10 million cells per mil for a 10 Plato beer. Maybe that's what you pitch. Why not 50 million cells per mil? Why not 100? It'll go faster, right? Yes, but you've got to allow the yeast to grow. That's what the lag phase is for. It's not that nothing's happening. The yeast are bringing in the nutrients, the oxygen. They're starting to make amino acids. All these things before you see CO2 production is critical because the yeast is growing and you need the right growth to make the right flavors. If you add too much yeast, you don't get the flavors. For example, that happens a lot with Hefeweizens. And that, again, that early kind of beer where people were collecting yeast from a yeast that didn't really flocculate very well. So just like the hazies of today, brewers cut their teeth on that with Hefeweizens in the 90s and trying to figure that out. And one thing is people figured out is if you overpitched because it's easy to collect too much yeast from one batch and put it in the next. All of a sudden the esters were gone. Hey, where's that banana character? You added too much yeast. So, you got to think about that. If you're thinking about that cell count, 1 million cells per degree Plato, there's a lot of times to go 0.5, 0.3, 0.8. If you really want to fine tune that to lower that yeast pitch rate when you want esters such as a Belgian beer, but those are high gravity, so you gotta be a little more careful. Hefeweizens and other beers where you want flavor compounds. Next question, how many times can you reuse the yeast before it starts mutating? There is no true answer to that question because it can mutate the first time. But typically, commercial breweries use yeast 5 to 10 times. That's a generality. They reuse it. Some reuse it 50 times. Some never buy new yeast. I went to a brewery a few weeks ago, probably a month ago now, that repitched only twice because they said yeast is not that expensive for what it contributes to the beer. And so they preferred that they had a great fermentation every time. Now that brewer's a little bit, doesn't have the same opinion as everybody else, but that's an interesting opinion. So people do it differently. Home brewers do it differently. often they're not repitching as much yeast because they're also using a whole bunch of different strains because they're making different beer styles. But in commercial settings, generally 5 to 10 times or 2 months, because 5 to 10 times can't be done over a year. Yeast would be sitting too long. Yeast want to be fermenting, and that's what keeps them healthy. But if there's any contamination pickup, then that's a problem. But if you're if a commercial brewery is not repitching yeast because they're afraid of contamination, they really shouldn't be making beer. Because there's no extra things you have to do with yeast propagation or yeast repitching that you shouldn't do in every single batch of beer. So if the beer is not clean enough to reuse the yeast, it's not clean enough, in my opinion, to be selling. Okay, next question. Thanks for bringing yeast all over the world and speaking. Great, thank you. What is your inspiration to get new strains? Is the isolation of strains from nature the most common method for white labs? How do you see the genetically modified yeast implementation in brewing? I know it's a controversial topic, but I am a microbiologist as well, and I believe that this could really open flavors. Okay, great question. A lot of stuff in there about yeast. The inspiration, getting new strains is often about, hey, what new styles do people want? Because styles are often driven, at least in part, by the strains, the locality of where those beers were made in the past, the features those strains add, such as a certain fruitiness, even with the hazies, it can be part of the flavor profile. It can be part of the haze. You can have a non-yeast haze. So there's a lot of ways strains work out in that. And so we continued to collect and release new strains for hazies. Same with saisons. Saisons were something that were extremely popular, say 10 years ago, and have faded a little bit, I think, with the ingress of hazies. That's what we've seen. But saisons were like that, like we would release a saison strain and another saison and then maybe a saison blend, because each new strain and combination of strains made a different saison. But you needed some classical aspects of those strains to make the right saison. And none of our strains are genetically modified. I feel that's up to the industry. Maybe one day that we're selling or licensing or something, some GMO strains. Of course, we have some different R&D projects always going on, but I think it's kind of cool that that beer is still made with non-GMO ingredients. There's no GMO barley or hops or yeast at this point. There might be a little bits here and there, but really it's not part of the industry. And when that changes, it'll probably change for all the ingredients, and then we will do that as well. But there are such great strains available from nature. Your work to make a GMO strain and then to try to protect it, and all the things people want to do with GMO products, I think it's going to kind of change this industry and maybe not be worth it. The natural selection or really the domestication that brewers did with strains from the wild, creating these brewers yeast strains and now offshoots through mutations that we have, give us a huge range of awesome strains. Okay, next question. Will we have, that's good, easy one. Will we have access to the recording after the webinar is complete? Yes. This will be on our YouTube channel over the next week. Already the first one of last week's is available. So you can email us or check our website and we'll direct you there if it's hard to find. Okay, question here. Like the pitchable yeast slide from 95 to current, with the 001 or 067 in my fridge right now, will I really see an actual benefit from making a 1 liter starter or 2 liter starter into my fermenter of 1060? My background is in biochemistry, not really worried about contamination, but I don't want to risk it or spend the time just because it's the homebrew thing to do. Okay, good question. So that yeast had those yeasts have a July expiration. So they were just made fairly recently. And they're not even really close to that expiration. You're going to make 20 liters, 5 gallons, it sounds like, in a 1060 beer. That's a medium kind of gravity. There was in the 1970s, that would have been considered a high gravity beer. But craft brewing has certainly changed that. And so a 1 or 2 liter starter, is there a benefit? That's a much harder question than is there a negative? There's really no negatives. As long as you don't introduce a contamination, there's no negative about making a starter. And it's the same way what I talked about before. If you introduce a contamination on your starters, then you got a lot to do, fixing to do on your beers, right? Because it's the same process. So you shouldn't be afraid of introducing contamination on a starter, and most people aren't. But if you are, then you got to improve your aseptic process to make clean beer in the first place. So there's really no negative for a 1 or 2 liter starter. Is it if it's necessary or not, or recommended or not, gets into the millions and billions of reams of information about starters that's on the internet. And my way of doing it, I wouldn't. We've done so many beers and analyzed them to detail with starters and without starters, looking at ester profiles, doing sensory. So that's where the conclusion would come from that pitch rate, over 100 billion cells in that package, to that 1060 beer, not seeing a difference in flavor profiles. But that's not to say some people do taste different flavors. That's why it gets controversial. So I'll leave it up to you, but I'd say there's no negatives to it, because you're not going to generate, it's not like you're going to overpitch. You're not generating that many new cells in the 1 or 2 liter starter anyway. But if you haven't tried not using a starter, try it. See what you think. That's when a lot of people come back and go, oh, I don't want to use a starter anymore. I just tried not using one. It was awesome. So what rate of, say, DAP, diammonium phosphate, would you add to a 20 liter batch? And does that range change with original gravity? And does it change when you use 30% adjunct? So diammonium phosphate is something that's in some nutrients, and some people add. The new nutrient that we came out with does not have any DAP in it, because some people don't want to add an inorganic kind of ingredient into the beer. So I don't have an exact addition rate for you. I think email us and we can get you an actual addition rate if you like for that 20 liter batch. And if you can supply more information, yes, the gravity, the yeast you're using, the recipe, we can help you out. Thanks. Next question. Do you have any plans to produce dry yeast? I know liquid yeast is your thing, but some of us have a hard time getting liquid yeast strains. Do you have any plans to produce dry yeast? I know liquid yeast. Oh, that's just, sorry, got repeated twice. Maybe, we're open to a lot of things. I mean, one thing we have is patience. 25 years, you got to have patience. And I think that's really important in business, and listen to people. We produce liquid yeast because liquid yeast makes the best beer. Not only the biggest range of strains, but it makes the best beer. Just put two side by side together. Even with the improvements of dry yeast today, the beer tastes better on liquid yeast. That is, you just do the side by side comparisons, and do a real sensory, and you'll see that. But that being said, a lot of people can't get liquid yeast, or it's difficult to get liquid yeast, or their brew house, or whatever it might be. So we do R&D. We got a robust R&D lab here with people working on R&D projects, and we are researching the dry yeast. That's what I can say. Whether we'll come out with it at some point, too early to tell. Thank you. Do you have any suggestions for making brut IPA? Is a question here. Okay. Yeah, somebody's asking about brut IPAs. Yay. I think what happened with brut IPAs is some were good and some weren't very good, and so the consumers lost a little faith in them, and they didn't really vary outside of one type of style. Brewed IPA is not just brewed. But I think the key is using the enzyme. Ultra Firm is the enzyme we sell. It's got a glucoamylase enzyme, and there's others, available. We found the best way to do it was adding it in the mash and adding it in the fermenter. Some people only want to add to the mash, but you really don't get the dryness unless you give it time. There's, you can do a 3-hour mash if you wanted, with the enzyme. But if you add a little bits in both, I think it gives you the right amount of carbohydrates to make that dry beer and the right flavor of the dry beer. And you really got a beer that has very low carbohydrate level afterwards. Next question. I have a 2-liter package that I've not been able to use before the expiration date because of the quarantine that's existing right now. What disadvantages would I have when using my yeast after the expiration date? Now, this is where homebrewers have years of experience on this because homebrew yeast is in retail stores. And we get questions all the time. The yeast is a year after the expiration date or 2 months or 3 months. And sometimes people make no starters with those. And that's when they email us and go, well, it worked. But by having that starter tool in their back pocket, they're able to, homebrewers work with yeast of sort of any age. And so that's what I would suggest with the 2-liter batch of yeast you have. I mean, the simplest thing for me to say, oh, no, don't use it, buy more yeast. But I, as a yeast person, would try to use that yeast. I would look at it in the microscope. I would check the viability. I would add it to a small propagation. So, for example, maybe you're going to use that yeast for a 5-barrel or 10-barrel batch. Start it in a 1/2-barrel or 1-barrel batch. If you've likely got significantly over 50% viability still there in that package. That's a lot of live yeast. Now, they might be getting close to death, but if you get them in a smaller batch of beer first, give that 48 hours, taste it, check the attenuation, make sure it's attenuated at least over 50% in those 48 hours, and then top it up to your 5 or 10 barrels. And I think you'll have good success, especially if you check the viability first. Okay, I've got some Kveik questions. With the rise in popularity of Kveik, we have tried several test batches in our pilot system. We have tried 3 strains. Is it common for them to have a farmhouse saison kind of vibe, or is it common for the ester production at the higher temperatures to be more farmhouse? Next question, to see if I can answer at the same time. Are there any additional concerns with Kveik in terms of acceptable sanitation, aseptic techniques? For example, like when you use Brett and Diastatica strains, you got to worry about cross-contamination. And the interesting thing about Kveik is it can be mean a lot of different things. It can mean a true farmhouse kind of beer with a mixed culture. It can be a pure culture and anything in between. What the strains we have produced and some others are pure strains that are hybrids of native yeast to that area of Western Norway and brewer's yeast from Europe. So that happened a long time ago, and this has been, researched by others to see the DNA sequence because now there's lots of DNA getting their full genome sequence. So you can find domesticated brewer's yeast in the Kveik strains, and you can find this other native strains. So it's Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So they're pure strains with some brewer's yeast DNA in them. And so we have seen no reason when you're using the pure strains to do any kind of different sanitation aseptic techniques, although I'd always advise the highest level for any brewery because there's wild yeast in the air of every brewery, not just the Brettanomyces you might be using or the Diastaticus yeast you might be using. There's Diastaticus yeast in your brewery, in the air. I mean, breweries are not in sterile environments. There's no autoclaves, there's no clean rooms usually. There's sometimes the packaging lines, and most times they're in the environment. So you have to be really, really careful of the environment at all times. So with the pure strains, you shouldn't have to do anything different, but just have the best already. and there's a variety of strains, and really from the different farms. So we're trying to name the strains and call out the farms where they come from. We have 3 more coming out and vault this week or next week. So they have a little bit generally of some farmhouse saison characteristics, a little bit because of that non-Saccharomyces cerevisiae domesticated DNA, but it's not phenolic, and that's the key to the Kvike strains, is that the phenols, which brewers have worked so hard to get rid of by training the yeast, by selecting the mutants. They did the same thing in Norway. So these strains don't have the phenolic production. And that's what makes them very versatile. Saison strains are phenolic, you know, they make saison. A few other things that might have phenols. But with the Kvike strains, without the phenol production, you can make a huge variety of beers. It doesn't just have to be hazy IPAs. So that's kind of cool. But you're still going to have some farmhousey kind of, maybe even small phenol characteristics in other strains. Trolls will tell you probably next week, you know, even looking at the DNA of lager yeast, how you can tell sort of how the phenols were mutated out or selected out of lager strains. So brewers, again, going back hundreds of years, have been the ones to select the strains without the phenols. And I think that's kind of fascinating. Have you done fermentation trials with Kvike at high temperatures and measured the production of higher alcohols? Good question. I know some brewers are scared of the higher temperatures for super valid reasons. But if you don't get to the high temperatures with Kvike, you won't get the ester production to be high enough. They'll be kind of drab flavors. And so the opposite sort of with other strains, you need to get into that, you know, 30 C, 90 Fahrenheit range, sort of even casting out of that temperature, so you can get the right ester character. So we've done trials where we've looked at different fermentation temperatures and looked at the esters, and they continue to go up as you get into that higher temperature range. And higher alcohols we haven't really necessarily measured, but I assume they're probably going up as the ester level's going up, but the ester level's up staying high enough to mask that. When will WOP 059 be next available in Australia? Great question, thanks. Sounds like we've got a listener listening in on this webcast from Australia. That's great, a lot of homebrewers there, and I love talking about homebrew there and visiting the breweries. And yeah, that's an example of a vault strain that we want to get better at making. And producing, and then letting the retailers, you know, people know when it'll be available. We've done a couple releases for you there of that strain that was supplied. Thank you. And yes, it will happen again. And we'll try to do a good job of letting you know when that will be. Thank you for putting that back in my ear. Okay, next, how many times has 5,000 labels been collected to get to somebody's homebrewer's house? That's a funny question, because we started Customer Club again over a decade ago. Joanne Corelli works with us, got that started with us, and now she's back working with us again. And one of the things about Customer Club is you can send in, used to be the labels, but now it can be labels, or it can be the pure pitch packs, the empty ones. And then we send you stuff. It could be books, shirts, things. And Joanne thought it was funny to just say, hey, I got a joke. I'm just gonna put, if they send back 5,000, you'll come homebrew with them. And we thought, that'll never happen. But the funny thing is, people started collecting them as groups. So I've done a few, yeah. I've Norfolk, Detroit, California, Texas. So I've done a few now of homebrew batches with people after 5,000 collections. So it started out as a joke, but you never know where jokes go. Next question. You say that you give, okay. Sorry, you say that you give a 6 months shelf life on yeast, but I read on the internet people using 1 or 2 year old yeast. How how long do you think it'll really last? Yeah, that's kind of the great question with shelf life, because we put a shelf life where we, through lots of trials, can say the yeast is over 50% viable. That was the intention with the shelf life originally, but really we're trying to shoot, for high 60s, 70s, and higher as in terms of a shelf life. But a year-old yeast might still have 50, 40% viability. That's still billions of cells per mil. That's a lot of yeast, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be thrown away. And so that's why a starter or a small propagation step in a brewery can be an advantage as, again, a tool for you when you have older yeast, because you can revive it and taste it, see if it tastes good, the beer that is the result, because it's pure culture. Nothing's going to change from that aspect over time. The yeast, we try to get the yeast in the great physiological condition through the 17-day process we have here, including the testing at the end of that 17-day process. So we work a lot to get the yeast in the right physiology with some extra storage carbohydrates that just naturally the yeast store, the glycogen, and then have the package right so it, again, releases CO2. So we try to do everything we can and then cold ship it. So the yeast is going to have the longest shelf life possible and keep that cell wall intact. And please revive them. Don't throw them away. A lot of good, healthy yeast still in there. Thank you. WP 585 is my favorite Saison yeast, but it has been discontinued. Will the strain be produced again in the future? Yes. And that's another example of vault strains where us making them and then communicating when we make them to the home brewers, the retailers, the pro breweries is something that I try to work on again every week here. And I had a meeting on that this morning. So it will come out again, and we hope we do a good job of letting you know when it comes out. Okay, next question. I don't know how long we'll go. We got a lot of questions. Maybe I missed you mentioning something about viability of your yeast packs over time. Could you speak to that again? I don't know if I have anything more to add to that since I've answered the last few questions, but Mr. Multi website is part of the question, and that's Jamil Zanishev's website. And he was the co-writer with me on the yeast book, and he's a good friend and a great brewer. Heretic Brewery now is his brewery that he started after the book. And there has been so much that has changed since that time. We keep telling, we keep talking about, hey, we should supply our viability numbers because we have great graphs of viability over time and different yeast strains. Just hasn't happened yet. He's busy with his brewery, and other people are here too. So we should get that information out. I think we have some of it out in our blogs, or I know we put that information out in some formats. I'm not sure how available it is. And so Mr. Multi is not based really on pure pitch. It's not really based on a lot of White Labs yeast. That was done before I met Jamil. So take it with a bit of a grain of salt in terms of telling you what the viability is. It's a great calculator, and it'll always tell you to pitch a whole bunch of yeast, which is not necessarily wrong, but it might be more than you need if it's White Labs yeast. That's all. So the best way to know the viability is to look at it under a microscope. Small investment. Microscopes aren't expensive like they used to be, super expensive. A fun thing to learn if you're have a stay-at-home order now. And it's a great tool to have to be able to look at the yeast, count the yeast, look at viability if you want to, but you don't have to use it just for viability. You don't even have to use it just for cell counts. You can say, does my yeast look good? There's some big breweries in the world that just put the yeast on the microscope and go, do they all look right? Yes. And don't even count it. Because they have other things in line to count. But there's a lot of value of looking at the yeast. And so that answers a lot of the questions I could get. Hey, how long is it going to last? How long can I store it? All these questions. Actually, if you use the microscope, that'll answer those questions because there is no right answer to a lot of the questions. Yeast is living. Are you feeling good today? I can't tell you if you're going to feel good next week, right? You got to look at them. You got to be the doctor for the yeast and put them under the microscope and say, yeast, are you healthy today? Can I use you? That's the best way to treat them. Okay. The question is, I visited your facility in San Diego and absolutely love the ability to taste the strains side by side in identical wort. Do you want to plug that experience? Oh, thank you. And talk about what inspired you to build that intricate system. Yeah, it is kind of a complicated brewery because we, instead of making a batch and scaling it up to bigger fermenters, we make a batch and we scale it down to the smaller fermenters. So we need 4 fermenters for every one batch. So that's a lot more fermenters. That's a lot more moving things because we want the exact same wort going into the 4 fermenters. Sometimes it's 2. And we just love talking about yeast. We love, like this whole webcast we just did. What if in 10 minutes it was somebody that didn't know anything about beer or yeast, and you said, try these 2 beers, see what yeast does? In 10 minutes they go, oh, I like this strain, I like this strain. And people start ordering beers off our menu by the yeast strain. So we offer that in North Carolina too. Asheville, we have the brewery there. Maybe someday in Copenhagen. But we do try to bring those samples around for different tastings. We have released beer sales in California. So we ship beer from White Lab San Diego to anybody who orders it online in California, like a lot of breweries started doing, especially now with less people going outside. So if you're in California, we can send you any kind of samples you want or any kind of beers you want. You can go to the website. In Asheville too, we do local delivery of beers and food. So thank you. All right, everybody. We could be talking about questions all the time, all day long, and I would love to do that, but we need to close the today's session. Happy to answer more questions in the future. Look forward to doing another webcast. I do a lot of seminars over the year at different places. White Labs does a lot of classes too. We have regular classes we do, yeast essential classes. A lot of people come to. Right now, we're not doing those in person, so we're doing this. And we also have some online learning classes that we have done, released, and you can look for those on our website as well. Little small cost to those, but we're going to keep adding new content as we go along. So thank you very much, and I'll talk to you again. Bye.